So tonight with us, we have Manuel Pais, who is a DevOps and delivery coach. He's focused on teams and flow. He helps organizations adopt, test, automation, and continuous delivery. And he works with teams on getting DevOps in terms of technical and human perspective implementations. He's been in the industry since 2000. He is based in Spain. He's working globally with customers from Belgium, Portugal, UK, etc. So he is the co-author of Team Guide to Software Releasability. He is with education in computer science. And without further ado, I wanted to pass on the floor to Manuel. Manuel, could you please tell us a few words about the topic for tonight?
Hi, thank you, Jim. And thanks, first of all, to the organizers for inviting me and everyone for attending. So tonight's, well, for me, it's the evening, it's 11 p.m. and for you, it's 5 p.m. So this evening, this talk is actually focused on around the book Team Topologies that I co-wrote with Matthew Skelton. And so that book is essentially around organization design for modern software delivery and operations. Kind of in a nutshell. And this talk in particular is focused on the remote aspects. So some of the ideas we talk about in the book are particularly relevant today for this, remote first context we are, most of us are living in right now. So that's the topic of the presentation. So let me share the screen. Second. Okay. Can you see my presentation? Good. Okay, I'll make it full screen. Let's go full screen. So first of all, I'm guessing for many of you, perhaps you've had remote working experience before, and so it's nothing new if I say that remote work is not about using Zoom or whatever tool and Slack, right? That's kind of the easy part in a way. But for many people who perhaps this is their first experience really working remotely, they will find this out pretty quickly. That having the tools, it's really not the challenge. The challenge is how do we actually work together remotely? How do we make decisions? When should we communicate when do we need a video conference? When should we write down information? All these things are kind of the difficult part. So it's really about tools, yes, but especially kind of the ground rules and practices. And even simpler things like what are our working hours? If you ask us a question on Slack, when should I answer, or when should you expect an answer? Is it the same day, or you're expecting that us to answer immediately? All these things, besides kind of the communication aspects, like making sure your tone is understood by the other person, that we don't get all these kind of misunderstandings that can lead to conflicts. So all of this is the difficult part, right? And in particular for interactions between different teams, if you have poor remote interactions, this can further stress pre-existing issues between teams. And so in a way, that's why I'm saying it can kill or really affect whatever, digital transformation, whatever that means, or DevOps transformation, if that's the case. Because if you already have some teams with this kind of silo approach of, or us versus them mentality that perhaps has been grown in the organization because of poor culture or whatever it is that led to that. But remote work is going to possibly make that much worse if we don't intentionally do anything about that. Essentially, it can slow down the collaboration and make any kind of initiative of improving flow and improving the way teams work together, slow down or even ground to halt. So this is the book I mentioned, Team Topologies, which is really where some of these ideas that I'm going to talk about are explained. Obviously, at that moment, we didn't have this remote first mindset, but many of the ideas are particularly useful. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about dependencies between teams, how to set team boundaries, and what do we mean by purposeful interactions in a remote world, and a little bit about feedback. So there are always team dependencies, right? So in team topologies, one of the key aspects we're talking about is how do we organize business and technology teams for fast flow. So perhaps not all organizations have this goal of trying to be faster in delivering their digital products and fast to respond to problems and so on. But most organizations do, right? If they want to compete in markets that have a lot of players and they're moving very fast, and almost every industry or many industries need this kind of fast speed. So one of the aspects of that is trying to reduce team dependencies, having kind of teams, these autonomous teams or cross-functional teams that I'm sure you've heard many talks about that. But how do we make that kind of a reality in a pragmatic way of we need those teams, but we need other types of teams as well. But here what I'm trying to highlight is that there's always going to be dependencies. Even when we look at some ways of getting more autonomy to teams, there are always going to be some kind of dependencies. So how do we deal with that? And the first step, of course, and especially in the remote first context, is to understand which teams are working on that, who is working on what. Because if we have dependencies, having the visibility on what are the teams that I depend on working on, when are they going to address the whatever work or response I need from them, when is that going to be addressed? And one of the kind of, I would say, the easiest way to do that is for each team to publicize, essentially, to make it very clear for everyone else how do they like to work, and their kind of team API, we call it, but essentially an interface to this team in the sense of here's how we like to work, here's our roadmap or whatever kind of work planning that we do. These are the practices that we like to adopt, in our work. These are our preferred communication channels. All these things compose this idea of a team API. And for this kind of effective ownership of software, but also the interaction between teams, each team can have their own team API, and then not only that, but actually actively promote that with other teams. Let them know, this is going to help you interact with us. And again, in a remote first world, this becomes even more important. So as I mentioned some of this already, so the team API can be, first of all, can be whatever the team finds useful to help other teams interact with them. But particularly some of the things we've seen is, if you own some artifacts, if you're the owner, then what are those? How can other people access them? If you have, for example, if you're a software delivery team and you have some kind of inner source model where you say, we are the owners of this part of the software or part of the system, but we allow other teams to modify as long as they, follow our versioning, our testing approach. If do we allow them to make a pull request, then how should that look like? To make it easier, basically, for other teams to make changes to our part of the system, if that's needed, obviously. And like I said, practices and principles, roadmap, and that, of course, in this context is very important. What are the priorities of the team? What are they working on? And how do they like to communicate? So we actually have on a GitHub account called Team Topologies, and there are a number of repositories. It's just their Creative Commons, so feel free to use if you find them helpful. It's essentially just some techniques or tools, if you like, to help apply some of our ideas in team topologies. So there's a team API template, which is, again, just a possible starting point for a team to clarify how they like to work. So to make it easy for others to find this information. So you can see there a number of details, information that might be useful. And of course, the team should add anything else that they think others might find useful. So once we have this more clarity on what each team is working on, what and how, then we can start also looking at tracking dependencies between teams, right? And there can be different types of dependencies. This is an example, just one possible way to track the dependencies between teams. This is actually based on the original article that talked about what was called the Spotify model. So back in 2012, I think, or perhaps earlier. And so besides what became known as the Spotify model, they also talked about a number of other techniques and things they were doing. And one is this very simple dependency tracking table where you're saying, well, for each team, what other teams they depend on. So this is just a fictitious example, but kind of importantly is first how many dependencies do we have, or for each team, how many other teams depend on them is perhaps interesting to address, because that's probably going to result in some kind of bottleneck if one team is, many teams depend on one single team, like a DBA or an ops team. That's probably familiar to you, this kind of problem. So you can try to identify what type of dependencies these are. Are they blocking in the sense that it's an actual handover of work? I might be in a delivery team, but I have to wait until the DBA team, for example, makes some changes to the database model for me to be able to continue my work. So it's going to block me. Or is a dependency that slows me down to some extent. If I could do it myself, it would be a bit faster, but it's perhaps okay. And other dependencies that don't incur wait times or conflicts in scheduling, all those types of things. There are other tools. So I recommend this book from Domenica de Grandis as well, called Making Work Visible. She talks about more in kind of on the physical world or physical space. You can have these boards where you highlight dependencies between different teams. But I mentioned the book also because it has, very a lot of great tips and ideas on how to address kind of the invisible work that sometimes takes a toll on teams and increases their lead times and increases their backlog unexpectedly and all these things. So it's really quite good, the book, and I think most of the ideas will apply even in the remote world. But so essentially, we know we have these dependencies. We can track the dependencies between teams, and then we can do something about it. We try to eliminate or turn the blocking dependencies into healthier dependencies, and we want to keep the healthy dependencies where they say, well, there is this dependency, but it's not affecting kind of the flow of work. It's not affecting the quality of work. So it's an okay dependency, but we want to track that and make sure also we don't get healthy dependencies turning into unhealthy dependencies for whatever reason, because we're introducing more gatekeeping or more process, and we're making things actually slower. And what I also want to make sure it's clear that when we're talking about reducing dependencies, this is not the same as saying, well, reduce the networks between teams. On the contrary, we want to keep building networks between teams, make sure there's time to socialize as well. So the things that you would have in a physical space that people from different teams are going to, because they know each other, they're going to have a coffee together or just go smoke a cigarette, whatever it might be. In the remote world, you'd actually be good to actually try to promote those interactions between different people in different teams. And so if you're a manager of a team, for example, or the team lead, then perhaps not only because right now, and naturally there's a focus on inside my team, what can we do to make sure we are connected and we are caring about each other as well. But between different teams, we should also start thinking about that, and if you're the manager or team lead, perhaps you can try to promote that and say, well, make sure you keep contact with the people that you are friends or in other teams. So, make sure you have the time, and that's part of your everyday kind of work as well, in a way, as if you were in a physical office where these kind of conversations happen. Kind of the point being that these networks between different teams, different people are going to be important, because when we have kind of complicated problems or projects or products, we're often going to need to rely on these dependencies. So we cannot just think in terms of our own team. Yes, that is the first priority, obviously, but in this remote world, but we need to think about, we need to keep these networks. And so if you have things like communities of practice, for example, or whatever kind of events you used to do, lunch talks or brown bag talks or whatever other events you had, make sure you have space and in your schedule and in your communications to keep that going. You don't want to kind of break the networks that you had before. The second part of this talk is around how do we set, team boundaries that are useful, because we need some boundaries to make it also clear when we should be interacting, when we shouldn't be expecting to interact with other teams for some types of work. So one interesting kind of related example, there was a study a couple of years ago where they were looking at a few organizations moving to open space approach for their office and coming from individual offices or cubicles, and they were expecting, or these organizations wanted to have much more fluid communication because people would be able to talk face to face in a much faster way. And then the study found out that there was actually the opposite effect of withdrawal of people. Well, they said up to 70% less face-to-face interactions in the open space. Because of course there was a lot of noise that was being introduced. If I have to listen to conversations that are not related at all to my work because we're in the same open space, then that's obviously not going to be a good idea. It's going to probably lead to people putting on their headphones, being able to concentrate on the work they need to do. So we need to be careful about this and try to promote the good organization of physical space and virtual space in a way that promotes different types of work to happen and promotes interactions, good interactions to happen, and somehow restrict the noise, if you like. So, and talking about noise and interactions between teams, there's also quite important to think about what are the different trust levels. So what do I mean by that? Or trust boundaries, if you like. So it turns out, and perhaps this is familiar for some of you, Robin Dunbar, he's actually an anthropologist at Oxford, I believe. So he's done a lot of research around how groups form, but not only in modern times, but going back to older civilizations and also going back to actual tribes, not the Spotify tribes, but actual tribes in the Amazon or wherever. And how do groups form? What's the number? How many people do we have in the groups and why? And so he actually found something that became known as Dunbar's number, that an individual's social network, kind of the number of meaningful relationships that any one of us can typically have is in the order of 100 to 200. So people tend to use the average and talk about 150 as kind of the number or the boundary where we cannot keep meaningful relationships with everyone anymore. And by meaningful relationships, it might be just we're able to have a conversation with that person because we know their name, we know their kind of role, we know where they, inside the organization, we know where they are situated, what kind of, which department they work for, which team they're in. And so we can have this kind of meaningful relationships. And that means we can have a trust level with this 100 to 200 people that is conducive to good interactions as well. And what happens when you go beyond that is then this kind of us versus them mentality or way of thinking tends to set in, because basically we don't know, we cannot keep social network with all these other people. Also, interestingly, he more recently did studies around actual social media networks, and the numbers still stood true. Because obviously, if you have 600 friends on Facebook, you definitely don't keep meaningful relationships with those 600 people, or at least I don't know anyone who can do that. So thinking about this for our organizations is also important. There's also, I put it here because it's an interesting article from Banford, who has kind of a background in the military. He had a military career and then he changed to software delivery. And he was talking about social inflection points, which are related to Dunbar number. And so, how many people can be part of what they call a section, which would be like a team in our organizations, how many people can be in a troop, which might be kind of a tribe, like in the Spotify model, and so on. The company is kind of, you see that number 100 to 150 as the limit to how many people can be in a company. And anthropological equivalent would be a village, how many people belong in the same village. So in the context of organizations, and in particular technology organizations, then we can look at these numbers as well. Up to 15 people as kind of the maximum deep trust we can have. So that's kind of maximum size for a team. Although we know from other research that typically 7 plus minus 2 people is more ideal in terms of reducing communication overhead. But if you have high trust, you might have teams up to 15 and that are still working very effectively as a single team, a single unit. And that 50 other kind of boundary is perhaps what makes sense as a tribe. So different teams that are working on on the same business domain, perhaps, or business segment. And so those teams have some level of interaction expected, not on everyday basis, perhaps, but kind of a weekly basis or whatever it might be. We're going to need to ask other teams, maybe even we're going to have to ask the legal team or about some aspects of the work we're trying to deliver. And so that makes sense as a kind of tribe. And then 150 is that kind of outer limit on how many people can we actually have meaningful connections. Essentially, the dynamics change in terms of trust when we cross each of these boundaries. So we should not expect that people can deal with larger groups, being part of larger groups and behave in the same way. So we should be aware of that. So it's interesting to think of how this can be then reflected in the virtual world, right? So we have a case study in the book, which from Autotrader, a company in UK, and what they did with their physical building was quite interesting in the sense that each floor in this building corresponds to one business domain, if you like, on one business area. So all the teams that work inside that business area are on the same floor, exactly to promote sufficient or make sure teams that need to communicate on a kind of a regular basis, not necessarily every day, but on a regular basis have that made easy for them by being on the same floor. Because what happens if I have to go to another building, or I have to even just go to another floor, then I'll probably, avoid this kind of more direct interaction and use other means. And so if this is the example in the physical world, what does this mean in the virtual space, right? Well, if we don't think about this and we have, okay, let's say we have a single Slack for everyone in the organization, or everyone in a large unit, then that's probably not going to work very well. People, again, if we go beyond that kind of 100 to 200 limit, and we have Slacks with, let's say, 300, 500 people, it's going to cause probably kind of more feelings that people will not have a good sense of direction, in the sense, who do I need to talk to, how do I find information, and even just kind of a feeling of losing the belonging to a group. It's because there are so many channels, so many people in the same Slack that I'm in a little corner and I don't really understand what's going on around me. So we can instead try to apply the same ideas, and as in that case study from AutoTrader, and perhaps we should think about having different instances of Slack or whatever tool you use, obviously, but make sure this virtual space is also aligned to those trust boundaries. So in this case, could be aligned to the business units that they had on different floors. But essentially being aware of the changes and the effect of going beyond certain group sizes on how people are going to feel about it, and how they will trust others. And beyond that, we can also, within each Slack or each communication tool instance, we can also think about channels that promote the interactions that we expect to happen. So if you see on the left side at the bottom, you see, for example, a channel called ST1 Platform Monitoring. This could be a channel for Stream Team 1 and the platform team to work together on a monitoring service. So imagine they are working on a new monitoring service for the application teams to use. So we call those stream teams in the book, but essentially we expect these two teams are going to have to interact, to collaborate for a period of time. So it makes sense to create the channel for that to happen. And so people know immediately this is where I should be communicating issues around that. Obviously, you might need other forms of communication with video calls and so on, but make sure the virtual space is aligned with what we expect that we need right now in terms of interactions between different teams. And on the right side at the top, you see support environments or support logging. So if you are in a team, and I'm sure this is not new for most of you, if you are in a team that provides some kind of service to other teams, then obviously have a channel that is aligned to those services. So it makes it easy. Not just a channel for support in general, even if it's the same team, but if you make it more specific to each service that we offer, then this is going to make it easier for the other teams that need the support to come to you and ask the questions in the right place. And in terms of each person who is in this virtual space, then we would like them also to identify, at least which team they're working on, their name, obviously, with a photo, so that we can, again, promote the feeling of trust of, we know this person and we trust the interaction. Just a quick note. So in the book, we talk about this for types of teams, topologies of teams, and that's why I use those names in these channels here. So platform, stream team, enabling team, and so on. But it can be whatever, it can be whatever makes sense in your organization. If you have application teams and you have operations teams and support teams, whatever, just make it hopefully as clear as possible. So having some kind of team focus conventions for the virtual space is quite useful. Again, these are just some ideas. This is not some set of rules, but some things you can think of. And the point being that with this team focus conventions, this is going to increase this discoverability, make it easier for people to find information, to find other people that they need to interact with, and essentially reduce what we call cognitive load on communications between teams as well. Making it easy. I don't have to think about who should I talk to, where can I find this person, especially in a remote world. And so, and the next topic are purposeful interactions, where I want to kind of do a couple of myth busting around collaboration and interactions between teams. One is that we're supposed to have this kind of infinite collaboration between teams. And to some extent, or in some organizations, DevOps in particular was interpreted as, okay, now we should be collaborating with everyone. And it's not exactly the same as we want to get rid of silos, yes, but doesn't mean that we should expect every team or everyone to talk to everyone else. That's not what that means, right? Focus on faster flow of work, less handovers, this kind of aspects, and not necessarily it doesn't mean necessarily that we expect everyone to be ready to answer and communicate to everyone else. So we need more or better defined interactions for teams to be effective, and in particular those kind of cross-functional autonomous teams to be effective as well. And so we talk about, these are not new ways of interaction. These are certainly familiar to you. So we can have collaboration where two teams are working together to solve a problem or to discover some solution to something they need to do. We can have X as a service, where typically one team provides a service to another team that consumes it. And we can have facilitating as one team helping another one gain some knowledge or upskill. These are common interaction patterns, if you like. What is kind of particular that we highlight in the book is that you should have a specific purpose and a specific time frame for any of these types of interactions. So it's not collaboration for as long as or forever, or as long as we think it might be needed. It should have a purpose. Why are we collaborating? Why are these two teams collaborating? They want to discover this, how this monitoring service is going to work, for example. How long do we expect that we're going to need to do that? Is it 2 weeks or is it 2 months? Because we're only working on this a few hours per week, whatever it is, but make that clear. And the same for the other interaction modes. Actually, X as a service kind of a little bit different, because you're saying, I have a service that's stable for other teams to consume. So I don't expect to have to collaborate with them, because if the service is really stable, is easy to understand and to use, then the other team can self-serve and doesn't require my help. So that's part of the idea of reducing handovers, but still providing the necessary capabilities to the product teams or autonomous teams. So again, the key is to make the interaction clear. What type of interaction are we expecting now, for what reason, and for how long? And this also helps us start having kind of more organizational landscape view of our teams. We can have a snapshot in time, as in this diagram, which what is basically saying is that we have two stream-aligned teams, or product teams, if you'd like. We have a platform team, we have complicated subsystem team, and enabling team. And then the interactions between them, we might be collaborating with the complicated subsystem team because we need some changes to be made to that subsystem. We might be working with an enabling team around helping us understand perhaps test automation, for mobile, for example. We have some gap in our skills as a product team, as a stream-aligned team, that this other team is helping us with. So I'm not going to go into detail about the different purpose and expected behaviors of all these teams, because it's not the purpose of today, but it's just we can start having a more meaningful view of which teams do we have, which gaps do we have, and what do we need to do. And in terms of going back to the team API, then this type of clarity on the interaction should be visible in the team API as well, or somewhere else if you prefer. Perhaps if we are back in the physical space together, perhaps we want to have boards on the wall that show us a kind of our expected interactions, or a team API in a wiki or whatever it might be. But just again, in this table, you can see an example where Streamline Team 1 is saying, well, we expect to interact with the test automation enabling team for duration of 3 weeks. And we expect to be with them for 2 hours a day. And the purpose is to understand test automation and how do I manage test data, and create some examples so that can help us get started much faster than if we have to do this all on our own. And we have another interaction going on with the face recognition subsystem, where we are collaborating with them to define some responses, some errors, and workflow for some in this case a problem with some photos don't get recognized, face don't get recognized, whatever it might be. Just to give you an example of how we can clarify purpose and duration of the interactions, which doesn't mean that it's actually going to be 3 weeks. It's actually going to be 2 months, and we should not go crazy about keeping this duration. It's just for us to have a sense of what's happening and for how long. And then if it wasn't 3 weeks, it was 4 weeks or 5 weeks, it might be okay. And in other situations, we expected to collaborate for 2 months and it took 6 months, then perhaps we need to take that as a signal that, why is this not what we expected? So we can use that kind of awkwardness if things are very different from what we expected in the interaction. That's kind of a sensing mechanism, a signal that, well, maybe we need to evolve. Maybe those services that we expected to be stable, that we could just consume, actually, they're quite difficult to use and to understand. Perhaps documentation is not up to pair. And so we actually need to go back and collaborate, perhaps, again, with the team that's providing the service to actually make it stable, easy to use, and understand. Another kind of myth, if you like, is when we look at the org charts as representing communication paths. So I was talking about networks between teams and people. And if you look at the org chart, which is obviously an important artifact for an organization, but it has some purposes, the org chart, which are relevant, such as reporting, perhaps, hopefully as a way to make sure we can align the strategic goals with what the work the teams are actually doing, this kind of aspects. But it should not expect the org chart to represent how teams communicate with each other. So what you can see here is that the reality of the actual communications are not going to follow this nicely drawn, lines of different areas of the company. So it's much more of a network effect. And so what happens, if you see there on the right side, you might have teams or even departments that are isolated from the rest of the organization if we're taking the org chart as representing how we're supposed to communicate. And particularly in some areas, at least from my experience in operations, for example, and especially for when companies that externalize their operations department, they tend to become isolated because we're promoting that they don't really have, there's no easy access to communicate with these people, it's perhaps only through tickets, and sometimes for internal teams as well, because we have this mindset that your org chart is representing communication paths, and that's kind of the problem. So I like this illustrations is from the book Team of Teams. Again, it's from a retired general, and it's based on the military context, but it's actually, I would guess many of you find this familiar, where we're designed for something on the left with this org chart, but then what happens in reality is much more of a network effect. And I also like this book, Organized for Complexity, where the author is talking about the fact that the key to successful knowledge work is not the formal interactions, if you like, or formal processes. Is actually the key is in the informal structure, informal networks, and how we create value through that. So essentially, we should let the real needs of our projects, our products, our services drive the interactions between teams. We should clarify those interactions, make it easier for the right types of interactions to happen, but we should not let the org chart decisions or formal processes decide how teams are supposed to interact or with whom they're supposed to interact. So I found this tweet quite sad, actually, when I read it, but illustration of when you take this to extreme. So I'm going to read it so you don't have to try to listen to me while you read it. So someone had a manager tell them they couldn't have lunch with their friends anymore because they were on the dev team and he was on the ops team. And the manager didn't want communication to happen between teams that didn't go through him, essentially saying communication goes through the org chart hierarchy. And so I found this quite extreme, but as you can see, it's from last year. So there are many organizations where this kind of thinking still takes place, and effectively is shooting yourself in the foot if you're putting restrictions that are not based on real needs, are based on, in a way, artificial constraints. Again, not meaning that the org chart doesn't have a purpose, but we should understand what is it for and what it isn't for. So again, on the topic of clarifying communication, also which channels we use is quite important. This is another template we have available open license in github.com/team-topologies, is around template for platform teams in particular. So teams that provide self-service to other teams. So these are some of the things they might need to include or to make clear, visible for everyone else around response times. How do I access services? Where can I find documentation, so on. But also in particular, so yeah, service details, which services are stable, which ones are being developed, but also especially what are the communication channels, and perhaps for different types of communication or different types of problems or reason for communication, we might have different channels, because if you want to report an incident in the service, then perhaps we need special channels where we have people always trying to respond as quickly as possible because it's an incident in the platform, and we want to address that quickly. And for other types of communication, for example, to provide feedback or ask for support, which is not so urgent, perhaps other channels are okay. By email, which perhaps the response time on an email is longer than a specific Slack channel that for incidents. So again, it's not about the specific things you see here on this template. Is about thinking, what do we need to clarify? And if we have different types of communication, what are the good ways to interact with us, and also working hours and things like this. One interesting aspect is also around incident response. So you have the typical 3-tier support, or multi-tier perhaps if you have more or less, and some people, especially John Hall, has some very good articles like this one that's linked and talks around why we should be looking at replacing 3-tier support with swarming. So we talk about this in the book a little bit, not extensively, because like I said, I think people like John Hall have a lot more in-depth experience there. But swarm means essentially for incident resolution that you have people basically kind of on call, people from different teams that can quickly get together and answer, and starting with diagnosing problems where we don't really know where is the origin or the multiple origins of this problem, which might come from the interaction from different systems. And so with a swarm, we're able to address that much more quickly than if we have 3-tier support, where the first tier is going to try to find a solution. It's not possible because it's a complex problem. Then it goes next tier and so on until it actually gets to the teams that can dig into it. And so I recommend that article I mentioned, and the slides will be available. But what I wanted to point out in this talk in particular is if you're, first of all, you might want to take this opportunity in this change of context to perhaps rethink things like 3-tier support. And if you do, then it's very important to set up the communication approach beforehand. Obviously, you don't want that during an incident you're trying to find out, sending emails, and then the other person is using Slack, and the third person is trying to get people on the phone. You need to clarify this in advance, right? You don't want to be worrying about the communication channels and patterns at the time of the incident. And you can do things like game day, for example. You do a simulation of an incident and you try out your ideas for how we're going to communicate and manage and respond to incidents. And kind of, I think incident response is an interesting area, but kind of it's a general pattern, right? If you are changing the ways of working between different teams, or trying out new approaches to solve or to respond to issues or whatever it might be, then think about the communication channels, the communication purpose in advance, and try it out and make sure it works. So you don't worry about that when you actually have to respond and do the work, let's say. So I'm almost at the end. Very quick note on feedback. We all know feedback is very important for everything essentially, but actually being able to give constructive feedback, especially in a remote context, is even more critical. And being careful around setting the right tones and giving the right messages in a remote world, it becomes even more critical. So the point is that it's actually a skill to give constructive feedback. And in this remote context, we should not just let feedback happen just organically, if you like, without being more intentional about how we, making sure we have feedback between different people, different teams, but also help people build the skill of providing constructive feedback in a remote world. There's one interesting technique that platform team effectively at Twilio did, which is that they wanted to understand how well their platform services were helping teams do their work. So I think once a quarter, or perhaps even more frequently, they run this survey with their internal customers, the other teams that use the platform, to understand how well does it help them build, deliver, and run their services, their products, and customer-facing services. And also, do they feel like the platform team is listening to their feedback, that the problems are solved adequately? And so this is a very simple way that you can promote feedback, in this case for a platform team, but you could apply a similar idea for other types of teams. And there are many resources. It's not about whether this is the right way to do it or not. It's just an example, but being intentional about it, not just letting feedback as a kind of afterthought, and perhaps it happened, perhaps it didn't, and we need to be more proactive about that. But like in this kind of complex, uncertain moment we are all in, then you essentially need to try what works around communication, around feedback, and essentially not just let things run their course. And we're not actually trying to be meaningful about what are the good interactions that we want to promote and kind of avoid problems, avoid conflicts. How do we do that? And again, we are going to have to experiment. I gave you some ideas in this talk, hopefully that you can try out, but you're going to have to find what works for your team, for your interactions with other teams, and so on. So just finalize, that's the book. We're actually working on kind of the workbook version of this talk, so expand this into with more concrete examples, which is going to be a free workbook by IT Revolution. So we're going to talk about it on social media and so on when it's available. But if you really want to be hear about it as soon as possible, then we have a newsletter. IT Revolution, the publisher of the book, also has a newsletter, so you can sign up for that. We have remote first, obviously, like everyone else, where we used to do 2-day trainings at clients, and now we're moving everything online. So actually yesterday we had the first half-day online course, which went quite well, but obviously we made sure we get feedback so we can improve. But if you're interested in any of that, we have the trainings and assessments as well. We do have a self-paced, so on-demand training on the PMI, the Project Management Institute platform, which is team topologies for project managers, but a very loose definition of project managers, if you like. So, and the PMI also talks about agile project managers. I think it's useful if you want to kind of get started understanding team topologies, different types of teams and interactions, it has a slight nudge for people in kind of leadership positions and in team leadership or project leadership to actually think about how their role might be changing if we have more autonomous teams that don't need as much direction from a lead, hopefully. Then how does the role of these people actually change to becoming more kind of cross-team enablers, if you like? Because a lot of these things still need someone to have the time and availability to work on that, on helping teams get the right interactions and making things clear, right? So it's a kind of a cross-team boundary role more. So we talk about that in more depth. We ask to have a 15% discount. Well, they give us a 15% discount. If you want to try the course, it's valid for 2 months, basically. And there are other really good courses from Jeff Gothelf and Josh Sadin and others like that. This is a set of resources. You can also have a look, some public talks we've given and articles and so on. And again, the repository on GitHub has, besides the ones I mentioned, also team cognitive load assessment, just some simple tools. There's nothing complicated. There's no code, there's no tooling. It's just really some templates and ideas that can help you get started. So I hope this was useful. So in my name and in the name of Matthew Skelton, who I co-wrote the book with, thank you for your time, and we can have a Q&A session now.
Thank you very much, Manuel. So the way that we can do the questions and answers is anyone who has a question, please write them down in the chat window of the Zoom software, and I will be reading those to Manuel. And Manuel, whenever you want to have the last questions, just let me know so that everybody's aware. We'll be finishing that So the first question is, Manuel, would you be able to provide the slides from this deck after this meeting?
Yes, I'll put them on my slide share, and I'll post about it on social media, so LinkedIn and Twitter. And I don't know if you normally share on through Meetup message or something. Okay, and I'll send it to you as well. So
Great.
whatever way, if possibly if you want it as quickly as possible, then you can check my social media. You
All
have
right.
yeah. Let me. Okay.
Awesome.
Should be easy to find.
Great. So there is a question about, in one of the slides, you're talking about mitigating dependencies. Mitigating a dependency, would you provide an example or two?
Sure. So I mentioned briefly.
Can you guys hear Manuel?
No.
Manuel, your audio disappeared. Nope, zero audio. Nope. Maybe if you try unplugging your headset and just using your computer microphone, if you can hear us.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. That's weird. Okay. Right. The question about how can we reduce dependencies. So obviously it depends on what the problem with dependency is, but kind of in general, I mentioned different types of teams that we talk about in team topologies, and those are all aimed at reducing dependencies on the product teams or streamline teams, while making it, pragmatically possible for these teams to be able to do everything that they need to do. Because when you look, so the issue I have when we talk about autonomous teams is that when we look at, okay, if we're saying this is a team with end-to-end ownership, they can go from an idea or a feature that's been asked to them all the way to production and monitoring how that is being used by your end customers. This is a very large set of skills and tools and the whole stack that you would need to understand to do that effectively. We cannot ask a team to be autonomous. It doesn't mean we just say it and then they become autonomous. It doesn't work like that. So all the other teams we talk about, the platform team provides self-service capabilities. The enabling team helps gain knowledge around different domains that teams have gaps with. And so that is kind of fundamental way that we're saying we've reduced the dependencies, we've reduced the handovers between different teams in the delivery lifecycle. We're saying the streamline team, the product team is the owner. They are the ones who are going to push the work through, and they're going to look at and monitor the features in production as well, so they can get quick feedback and bring that feedback into the next iteration of the product. But they need help. Basically, they need a support system around them, and that's where the other teams come in. Again, self-service capabilities for a lot of things that we need, such as infrastructure provisioning, networking, monitoring, CI/CD. All these things we should not expect a product team, an autonomous product team, to have to worry about installing tools, understanding how these tools work. We should provide them the capability as kind of consumers, not the owners of this kind of lower level services. And you can get more complicated platforms where you have not only these lower level services, but also kind of more specific, business specific services around data APIs or whatever it might be that helps all the teams to self-serve their needs. And so from Team Topologies' point of view, that's kind of the key idea of reducing dependencies. So effectively they stop becoming hard dependencies, where we say we have to stop here and we're going to let the infrastructure team, create the resources, or we're going to let the the operations team do the monitoring. We avoid those kind of hard dependencies, and we start having soft dependencies in the sense of I need this capability, so I depend on the platform to provide me the services that I need, but it doesn't impact the delivery of the work, the flow of work. But again, it depends what type of dependencies, and sometimes it's simpler things where we might want to remove, if we have, many approvals in our delivery lifecycle, then we might start looking at, which approvals might actually be removed. And often it's also process gatekeeping aspects that are coming from historical perspective, where the organization faced some problems. They put in place this kind of gatekeeping to try to avoid this problem in the future, and then no one ever looked at that anymore. And when you start piling, grouping many of these type of manual approvals processes, then it's going to slow you down your delivery considerably.
So in other words, it's re-examining the dependencies and finding ways to mitigate the inefficiencies that they create. Okay.
Actually, yes.
All right. If each group of 150 or from 100 to 200 people within an organization are separated, the example you showed, there were different floors. We also spoke about different Slack instances. That would lead naturally to us versus them. How do you suggest to handle that internal us versus them mentality?
So I guess if you're looking at the point of view of if we have a good alignment of which business value streams or business areas do we need, we make sure those are within this kind of Dunbar number boundary in terms of number of people working on it. If we're talking about then between those different groups, so first of all, the amount of communication and interaction you would expect at that level is much lower, right? And again, you should promote kind of social interactions between those different groups. You can have, for example, internal tech conferences or other types of internal conferences where you say, well, people from different groups are coming together and talk about their work and promote, we would have coffee breaks if it was on a physical space, but promotes virtual spaces where people can ask questions. Someone gives a talk and then you have 15 minutes or half an hour for this person to answer questions in Slack or in Zoom. There are different ways. Essentially, if you have doing any of this, or communities of practice are also very powerful to make sure it's, and I get a question kind of related to this. Often people ask me, what is the difference between community of practice and enabling teams? Why one or the other? And I think both are important for slightly different reasons. Communities of practice, effectively, yes, there is knowledge sharing, but it's also the social aspect and network aspect. Make sure people know each other across different business areas, across people who are working on similar roles, but different parts of the organization. That they have a space where they can have that contact. And enabling teams are more directed. They are trying to address a specific gap for a specific team, and that's not always possible with communities of practice, which are more kind of a loose gathering and sharing. Yeah, I don't. Yeah. That was the original question.
Yeah, that makes sense. Is X as a service team, is that another form of siloed feature team?
I hope not. In the way we talk about X as a service is, I guess the question is perhaps, if we're saying this team is responsible for this service, are they going to go and just work on the features of this service in kind of isolation and then come back to here's the service? That's not what we talk about. So X as a service, especially for platform teams, if they're providing self-service capabilities, then they should be working as a product team. So we go into what is the definition of a platform as well. And essentially, a platform should be an internal product. It has internal customers, but should be treated as a product. So like for customer-facing products, you want to do it in an agile way and iteratively. You don't want a team saying, okay, we're going to work on the monitoring service for 6 months and then we'll let you know when it's ready. That's not what we are talking about. We're talking about going back to the interaction modes, then you should be collaborating with a stream team or a product team that needs this service. So you're actually understanding their needs, and you have the benefit that you are in the same organization. So it should be easier compared to end customers to get quick feedback and definitely prototype, get quick feedback, and make sure you're addressing the real needs. It's not about this team working on this service goes off for some months and with a bunch of requirements and then comes back. That's not what we're talking about.
Right. All right. Can you suggest a remote team story mapping software?
I don't know any particular tool for that now.
Okay. Yeah, there was one suggested feature map. So thanks, Sheila, for suggesting that. There is another question. Oh yeah, somebody else suggested Miro.
Oh yeah, I was going to talk about Miro.
Yes.
I started using Miro for remote training. It's very flexible and it has a good set of tools to help you. So I've seen some interesting examples of how people have used it. So it has some good templates, and I think there's a story mapping template, but basically you can have a open canvas and just create your own way of template for doing things. So it worked quite well for us for doing exercises and doing collaborative work between different people.
Great. So the next question is actually two questions. I'm going to separate them. It's in regards to the Slack channels that you have shown. How do you make up each of those streams in Slack? How do you include entire Scrum teams working on a specific product increment, or you include only developers?
No, we're always talking at the team level. So we're always talking about which teams. We're not going at the individual role point of view. So obviously you would want each team to have their own Slack channel unless they decide they don't want it. You should have each team have their channel and then have channels that promote interactions between teams. So if you have a Scrum team, I would expect that team to have a private channel for themselves. And then if they need to interact with others, then you create channels for that to happen. Or if they provide some service to other teams, then you create a channel for that.
Yeah, so when you say private, you mean that safe space for the team,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And the other question that's relevant to this one was, what do you do if some member is also a member of more than one team? Do you have them in multiple channels?
So I would reverse the question and say, if you have a team member that is in 2 or more teams, is he really or she really a team member? Is that really a team when you have some of the people in the team are actually kind of part-time there? So that's another thing we talk about. What is really a team should be clear, and we have our own opinionated view, which is that a team is a stable, gelled group of people that are dedicated to that team, and they're long-lived. It's not we don't consider any group of
bringing people together to do a project, it's not a team from our perspective in this sense. It's just a group of people working together for the period of time. And so I would say that first, I would try to avoid that. But there, you know, if that's the case, then yes, there is a kind of a overhead for this particular person having to be in two different Slacks. But that's, I would figure, there's already a lot of overhead of managing two different sets of work or contexts where this person has to be involved in. So I try to avoid that.
Yeah, I mean, for Scrum Masters, it's I would say very widespread that they handle more than one team. All right, next question is, one all remote team that I worked with decided to make their Slack channel accessible to everyone. Do you have any reflections or reactions to that?
Yeah, I don't know what was the rationale to do that. It's, again, it's not about is that right or wrong, but at least they made a decision that, you know, this is okay for them. I wonder if that's not then, like you were saying, Jim, affecting their, you know, kind of psychological safety inside the team, if they're saying, you know, using the channel to express their views, and there might be people from other teams that don't get the context, or, you know, you might get communication in that channel from other teams which is kind of disrupting your internal team communication. Mm-hmm. But I would guess they have a good reason to do that, and that is really the key, that, you know, they know why they made that decision. Perhaps it's because they are very a team providing a service, and so they rather just have everyone always on the same channel, all the requests in the same channel. I don't know.
Yeah, the context was they wanted to simulate having the open floor where anybody could overhear what everybody else is talking about.
Oh. I think that's equivalent to saying, well, you know, if you have an open floor, you don't want someone standing up and shouting to the other side of the room and saying, hey, can you do this? You know, can you give me this information, or can you do this for me? That would not be a good, adequate interaction, right? Because you're causing noise and affecting others. So you should be careful about that. So I mentioned, I think, that example of there's this study from 2 years ago where they actually found people withdrew from direct communication when they were put in a physical open space. So I would say the same is true from a virtual space, where if you try to make it open, but then this can lead to a lot of noise, a lot of confusion. So I would recommend trying to make the spaces more focused, more. Of course, you need to clarify and make easy for every other team that needs to interact with you to understand how to do that. But that doesn't mean that a single channel is going to help. It's not. The openness is in clarifying through the team API or whatever other means, clarifying that your communication channels, different types of communication, and make that easy to discover by other teams.
Thank you. All right. At this point, I wanted to open the floor to any other questions. There are no more in the chat. All right. Well, thanks a lot, Manuel. I think it was very informative meeting. And I wanted to give the floor to Mary. Mary probably could say a few words about the upcoming meeting for the New York Scrum User Group.
And just want to say thank you, everyone, for participating and taking the time to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. And thanks, everybody. Next month, we're going to have Design Thinking, a workshop with Jeremy Frank. And what's great about Zoom is that we can do, if you attended the World Retrospective Day, you know, we can do breakout rooms, so we will be able to have very interactive sessions. So that's next month. And I just want to thank Manuel again, once again, very, very much for this great presentation and for making it available to us. So thanks. Clap, clap, clap. And hope we'll see you again soon. I forgot what country you're in. Can you remind me?
I'm from Lisbon in Portugal, but I'm based in Madrid.
Right
so,
now you're in Madrid, right? Yeah. So thanks for staying up.
Quarter past midnight. It's okay. A normal
Really
day.
appreciate it. Yeah. So thank you, everybody. I think that's it. Yeah. And oh, and special